Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome to today's edition of the International Neuropsychological Society Teleneuropsychology and Digital Technologies Special Interest Group. It is my pleasure. I'm Monica Ganes, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's edition with our stellar supporter friend, Dr. Tony Puente. Dr. Tony Puente is native of Cuba, and he has been here since 1960, and he has taught at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington since 1981. He has a lot of accomplishment, and he's the founding director of the Centro Hispano, and his research focuses on interface between culture and neuropsychology. He has been editor of many journals, has published 10 books, 95 chapters, 125 scientific articles in several languages, and he is a professor at North Carolina, Wilmington, as mentioned. He was president of the American Psychological Association, and he also has served on the American Medical Association Current Procedural Terminology Panel, such contributor to this field. He serves on many boards, and he also has served at the state level for his associations, the Hispanic Neuropsychological Association, for NAN, Society of Clinical Neuropsychology, Behavioral Science, and of course, now is contributing to INS. So it is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Tony Puente. Thank you, Tony.
Good afternoon to some, good morning to others. Thank you for being with us today. And I look forward to sharing this information, both through the presentation and also through the PowerPoint that Monica and Yukil now have. More than happy to share that with you as well. So let me share my screen and tell you that I have a fairly significant set of slides, but my goal is to only provide the slides as a way to have you consider them a source rather than the entire presentation. There's some slides I have there just to really quickly go over, and some slides that I'm going to do a deeper dive. And some slides that for the first time I'm going to present today, actually a good chunk of them. So I take full responsibility for all the typos. I and one of my grad students checked them, but who knows? So hang in there. Let's see what we got. Okay. Well, first of all, my lab is full of really super people, and I'm very fortunate to have them all. And the ones that I've named here in red are the ones that have been working with me on this project for quite some time. To thank them that they have really allowed me to go deeper on this particular issue. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to have 4 sections in our presentation. First, I'm going to give you some background some of it is just routine, and some of it is just about CPT and the use of codes. You may have seen some variations of the theme. And then I'm going to go into what may be the most interesting part, the research, which I barely talked about at NAN, and I'm presenting for the first time ever today. And this has to do entirely with Tele-Testing, or Teleneuropsychological testing. And I hope that you find these new pieces of information intriguing. And then I'm going to tell you about the recent policies, things that are working as we speak, and literally at APA, in Congress, and elsewhere. And also I'll share with you some of the things that we're doing away from Congress and away from APA that may actually influence the kinds of things we're talking about. And then, if you don't mind me sharing with you some possible likely outcomes and possible paradigms based on what I think is happening and what may be happening, especially at the policy level, so we can anticipate and get ourselves prepared. So with that very brief introduction to what we're going to share today, let's jump into it. Okay. So first of all, this is my disclaimer. Please, I'm doing my best. I don't know everything. And if it's wrong, Well, I wish it wasn't, but good luck. All right, so lots of organizations have supported this work. It started with the North Carolina Psychological Association when I was president back in 1989, 1990. And then really these days comes heavily on the shoulders of the Healthcare Finance Office and Committee and the Testing Advisory Group of APA. So these are the folks that really make this happen on a day-to-day basis. Steve Gillespie, who took over Randy Phelps, the newly developed Healthcare Finance Office at APA. Neil Pliskin, who replaced me on the CPT panel as advisor to APA. And then from my staff, Don Ben and Helmar at San Brenna. Don Ben is the office manager who I think teaches me more about what I do in this particular world than I think I know. All right, so if you're wondering if I made a ton of money, no. The little money that I've gotten, and it's all outlined here for you in case you're really concerned, has gone to a budget at the university that supports the grad students that work in my lab. So no, this has not been a source of income. As a matter of fact, if anything, has been a loss of income for all the times that I've been involved in these activities. But on the good side, it's been a source of frequent flyer miles. All right. Hey, don't forget that what I'm telling you is aspirational and it's my interpretation. I don't represent any particular group here, even though I work very closely with many of them. Keep in mind that there's standards and guidelines that you must follow. And I think one of the ones that we often really forget about is the contractual agreements that we have with third parties that provide reimbursement. Although surprisingly, a fair number of us in this survey that I'll share with you do not take third-party reimbursement. But that will be the guidelines that you will be used if there's ever any ethical or legal challenges. So keep in mind, they may not apply to you directly, but they will do so indirectly. All right. So this next section is really just a summary of major issues that are going on, which indirectly apply to our discussion today. But I just thought I'd take this platform to very briefly update on what's going on. First of all, units of service. That's always a big, big, big deal. Keep in mind that we're doing units that sometimes are 30 minutes and sometimes an hour, and that complicates things immensely. In addition to that, realize that when you think about testing, think about in sort of three parts: interview, testing, and feedback. They're entirely different things and could be generating three different reports and, for that matter, three different bills. Just be on the lookout that probably the golden cutoff is going to be in the single versus double digits. In terms of the interview, you should always consider doing an interview before you do any kind of testing, but it's nothing else because it sets up the medical necessity for testing, whether it's teletesting or not. And then consider using the mental status, neurobehavioral status exam rather than the psychiatric interview. And of course, real quickly, match the ICD diagnosis with the CPT code. Always remember that we start with base and add and put add-on codes. And this might be particularly critical in issues having to do with teletesting, including the model that I have been using as I emerge from COVID, which is a hybrid model, or you do both physical and virtual activities. And in some cases, the base code should probably match the add-on code, which is what you put to the addition of the base code. I don't think you should do a base code that is physical and an add-on that's virtual. It gets very complicated, and it might produce an audit signal that may challenge your reimbursement revenue stream. Always think of the follow-up as something that occurs after the testing, and that in itself will be very similarly, at least philosophically and from the procedural perspective, as you'll see in our presentation today, very tied in to the interview. And again, there's lots of material you can look at later time for what might be useful to include. As far as in trainees and insurance, I know Jaquil and others are very much involved in the training of students. This is going to be a major issue as we move forward, and I'll talk about it as well. Keep in mind that there are really two ways to look at technicians / trainees. One is Medicare and the other one is not. If it's Medicare, you have a different way to perceive the situation, and they're not necessarily billable activities that you can pursue, whereas everything else, whether it's private pay or other third-party carriers, you're good to go. In terms of supervision, which I'll talk about a little bit because of some recent regulatory changes, it's all about what we call general versus direct. You don't have to be in the room. Probably you ought to be somewhere in the vicinity, maybe, quote, in a geographic location such as similar building. But all things being equal, it does provide a little bit more openness as we move forward. And this is a big concern because some of the approaches that we have in terms of teletesting includes having the technician in another location, and that could pose some conceptual challenges for an audit situation because technically speaking, one should be in the vicinity. And if your technician is, say, an hour or two away, it could be a different issue. So stay tuned as we go forward on this particular issue. All right, let's just make sure, in case you are not familiar, please take a look at the Interorganizational Practice Committee, IOPC, started by good colleague from the Boston area, where most of you are at, who are holding this activity, and Karen Postal, who she and many others, from Maggie Lanka to Bob Builder and different codes, have been so instrumental providing a toolkit that all of us should be very, very familiar with. All right, now let's jump into the real interesting part of our presentation today, and that's the recent research. Now, we've done a little bit of research in the last month or so, and again, I'm not going to go into this for obvious reasons, but I just wanted to share with you some really good research that could be useful as you do your own interpretation of what's going on and how we might move forward. Now, I want to focus now on my own work that I've done with the individuals I shared with you a little bit earlier. And just to give you some quick background, when we were starting to think about life after COVID, or even during COVID, some of us really went out of our ways to try and lobby for teletesting. As a matter of fact, I was together with several people in Congress in March 12th basically on the eve of when COVID descended upon Congress, and for that matter, APA shut down 48 hours after we were in Congress. And we were lobbying at that time for telehealth, if you will, which of course worked out awesome under the circumstances. But when we started doing, we realized, oh my goodness, there's pretty little research. Some of the work from Monroe and others, Monroe Cullum, of having a technician elsewhere was basically the best we had. So little by little, some of us have been starting to do research, and this is the last version of my interpretation of what's going on. And this is the research that we formally started this year, and many of you participated. We have about a little bit over 300 surveys that have come in that are usable. And I want to share some of the findings because there's a lot of rich data. So here's what people are telling us, that a good chunk of you are doing telehealth, if you will, with adults, some less with pediatrics, and some with geriatrics. Now, I don't know whether this reflects the general population of neuropsychologists, but it certainly looks that way. Now, let's move on to the next set, and that is, where are these folks located? Most of us appear to be in private practice that participate in survey, but a good chunk of us are also in institutional settings. Here's an interesting question, which we really just assume that everybody's going to answer yes, and turn out not true. Are you doing face-to-face testing? And about a quarter of our survey recipients said no, that only 75 that participated actually said yes. And what we discovered is, when we had the opportunity to get commentaries, boy, there are some people that were rabid on both extremes. On one hand, Some said this is the only way to go. And on the other, some folks said no. And over my dead body, I'm never going to do virtual assessments of any sort. So we had extremes in terms of the qualitative data that we were able to obtain, but assuming that this is a reasonable interpretation of or a reasonable sample of the folks who are doing neuropsych out there, it looks like a good percentage of us are not or have not done virtual assessments of any sort. Now, let's go into a little bit of a more of a deeper dive. So we had lots of questions, and again, I'm only taking out a good illustration rather than a comprehensive one. And here's what I want to share with you, that most people appear to say that any kind of interview appears to be fine. And if you're doing deposition, no, not a big problem. And testifying in court, as well as providing feedback. So to summarize, it looks like interview and feedback appear to be common activities, whereas as you see from this particular slide, only about half of us are actually doing testing. And we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of what's going on. So we ask them, are you feeling comfortable about all of this? Well, as you can see, that it's really all over the place. Some 20% of us says, no, I don't think we should do this, which reflects about 25% of the people said don't do testing. About 24% said, well, we kind of agree, and only about 18%. So it's skewed towards like, we're not super confident about what we're doing, but stay tuned, because as we go through the presentation, the last slide gives you a different perspective of where we should be going. All right, so what are you doing? How are you doing this kind of evaluation? Less than 2% did audio only, 5% did visual, and it looks like about 80% did both. And again, a good percentage of our peers are not doing this at all. So it appears that any kind of evaluation, and as you'll see that there are different forms and different types of activities, but at the present time, it appears that maybe 80% do both. All right, this is surprising, unless, of course, you, like me, walked away from this great battle with Congress in March a couple of years ago, saying, my goodness, we finally did it after all these years trying to get Congress to support this. And then when we actually start doing it, because many of us had not been doing it. In fact, I'm not going to share with you, but a lot of data that we have here says that many people, this is the first time. And I raise my hand in this. I am also a first timer with regards to teleassessment. And again, the 25% seems to continue. About a quarter of us are not interested in doing. But for those of us that do it, it looks like about 2 hours is the most common, with some going up to 3. But when you get a little further down, 12% are doing more than 4 hours. So it looks like if we are doing it, we're doing it relatively brief, relative to how long typically we do it in face-to-face situations. Now, here's another interesting question. It has to do with what domains are you comfortable in doing, and what domains are you currently doing? We basically did a little bit of both, but as you can see, there are 4 domains everybody seems to be, not everybody, but a good portion of us seem to be comfortable with: language, memory, orientation, and psychopathology. And some, like motor, less than 1%. So there seems to be some domains that we seem to be ready to go after, and other domains that we're simply just not going down that path at all. Well, here's the question of like, what's the problem here? Why are you concerned about all of this? Theoretically, you should be doing this because after all, we have COVID. Well, as you can see, the red, which I've highlighted for you, are basically the top vote getters. Inaccurate assessments to distraction, poor nonverbal communication, technological incompetence, broadband sensitivity issues, which appears to be number one, sometimes lack of access, communication, and testing environment not conducive. Now, in recent research and in my own experience, it looks like there's something else that is really problematic or embedded in all this. And I'll bring it out just to make sure that we put it on the table, even though we're not going to discuss it a great deal. I have both a private practice and also a free clinic for indigents that we work on every other Wednesday afternoon. The folks in that free clinic don't have broadband, don't have computers, and don't have smartphones. All they have is at best flip phones or a landline. So in those circumstances, we have to keep in mind that we also have a different problem that we really didn't grab with this survey, and that this is also an issue of social justice, that if we demand certain kinds of computer technologies, and for that matter, broadband, we're also going to be probably limiting a large percentage of people that seek and need our services. So the challenges are clearly significant, clearly they're comprehensive, but they also reflect an issue that's hidden within the data, and that is that it's also a socioeconomic issue as well. All right, let's continue. How are people doing this? Now, the data here is pretty interesting, except one, I have to be honest, I don't know we have any ability to dig deeper and find out what other is, but it looks like Zoom is number one, and then audio phone call surprisingly is number two, and EMR-based platforms are number three. So Zoom is the big one in terms of how are people doing this kind of work. Now, what about the issue that I mentioned earlier? And note, probably the most surprising thing in this particular slide is that sometimes it's available. Now, I'm not sure how you can say sometimes it's available, because either you have broadband or you have a computer or you don't. In my particular case, I have to be frank with you, that the socioeconomic divide is ample. If you have insurance and you're employed, the likelihood is you have broadband and probably a laptop, if not a desktop, and if not, the opposite. All right, a big issue that has been raised because of COVID is what we might call interjurisdictional boundaries, and that is, can you practice across state lines, especially if you're not licensed in other states? Well, apparently only about 25-26% of us are doing it, and most of us are not. This is a major challenge as we move forward. For example, in the state of North Carolina, I believe I may be the only neuropsychologist that speaks Spanish. And if I'm correct, I think we have to go all the way down to Atlanta or even Orlando to find another one that speaks Spanish. So are we now, with COVID, being forced to explore the possibility that we could work across state lines? Well, I think the answer is that we might not be doing it, but maybe we will be doing it. So here's the question in a different form. Do you think we should do it? And it appears that about 1/3 of us believe that that's something that we should do. And maybe, probably, yes, but relatively few of us said no. So I believe there is a future for interjurisdictional activity for telehealth, especially if we have a particular niche, such as language, cultural, or even a specialty. That is an issue that we need to address as we move forward, because what COVID did for us is open up or maybe force boundaries that or horizons that we never imagined were possible. And here's one of them. All right. And for I believe, our last slide regarding our research before I move on to policy issues, here's one. Should teletesting continue? You remember, about 25% of us said no, they're not doing it. And when we look at the qualitative responses, a lot of very, very strong opinions saying no, We don't have the science. This is a social justice issue. I'm not interested. I miss so much, with doing anything electronically. But half of us believe that we should continue, definitely. And if you add the probably, we're talking well over 2/3. So is there a future for teletesting based on this sample? Definitely. Is there a need? Definitely. Are there barriers? Unfortunately, plenty. Let's see how we can break those barriers as we move into a world where we have both face-to-face testing and other alternatives as well. All right, so now let's talk about some recent policy stuff that folks at APA, and for that matter, myself and Neil and among others, have been working on. And some of them may seem probably like disinteresting to you, but I want you to realize that what we're trying to do is establish a system of neuropsychology that it's well outside of traditional boundaries of just seeing a patient for an interview, just seeing a patient for testing, and then providing feedback. We believe that the future of psychology in general, and specifically the future of neuropsychology, is one that has more of expansive horizons than we have historically done. Just to give you an idea, my son, who I think is on our presentation today, is doing the same darn test that I was doing when I got into the 1980s. What's going on here? It's time that we begin to have a more ample view of who we are and where we're going. So let's talk about what some of that policy is. This is a slide for those of you who want to know more, that there are different directors of APA. There's, of course, a current procedural terminology, and finally, there's an advocacy, which if you want to know this last part, especially APA Services C6, is where all the APA advocacy is. And this is something that was very, very much involved during my presidency in developing and eventually implementing. So that's where all the action is in that third column. But what is the action? Well, there's three sets of things going on that I want to share with you. And if you were at our NAN presentation, please note that this is an update of that. So this is not a reframing of that. So we have some new codes, we have some new guidelines, and some things that are just percolating as we move forward in the beginning of the new year. So let's start with the new codes: behavioral health integration, caregiver behavior management training, and consultation codes. All codes that I think any neuropsychologist could be and maybe should be considering as you begin to think of neuropsychology in a different light, as 2.0, as one of my colleagues has said before, or maybe even a 3.0. All right, first of all, it's the whole idea that you can provide, if you will, integrative work, not just you, but others as well. So now we're in a position that we can integrate what we do. Just sending the report is not enough. In some cases, you have to integrate it with others that are providing healthcare. This is a new avenue, and one that is applicable to healthcare delivered in this fashion and telehealth fashion. And here's the code: 99484. You have to do it for 20 minutes, and it's a whole idea of explaining what you have discovered for others. Just sending the report, not only is it not enough, but probably it's insufficient to make sure that the impact that your hard work and 10 hours worth of activities actually ends up having an impact. In addition to that, we have caregiver behavior management. So you finally do the evaluation, and once you finish the evaluation, you want to explain, you want to educate, you want to provide some tools for how to deal with these challenging situations. Well, here's a new way to do that. It's outside the psychotherapy codes, and for that matter, outside of what we call health and behavior codes as well. Here are the codes: 96X70 and 71. A lot depends on what the new CPT book will come out in the beginning of next year. But this is what you have. Again, you have multiple group management, And then you have a base code, as I shared with you earlier, together with an additional code, which is almost always our time-based activities. And then, of course, consultation. Oh my, how many times have you been involved talking to folks electronically, whether it's a telephone or else? There have been codes available, but those codes have historically not reimbursed. Now we have a set of codes that could be reimbursed, or it looks likely that they will be. And these codes will be useful to try and provide additional information beyond what you've already done. Again, this is a code likely to be a telehealth code as we move forward. And the consultation codes are 446 all the way to 51. Again, you see, like everything else that I've shared with you, a base code that is basically going to be modified based on additional minutes of activity. So another code that you could or should consider as we begin to expand our horizons away from a standard just doing neuropsych testing. All right, so the new guidelines, as you know, APA put together with some of you that are on this phone call, a really nice set of testing guidelines from 2019. Among other things, they just have been outgrown, including because of the issues having to do with Tele-Testing. So those have been worked on really well by folks like Jennifer Morgan and others. Tiffany Mays from Barrow and others have done a marvelous job. I will tell you secretly that I did a terrible job. I didn't do my job as well as the others, but that will be released in the very near future. Stay tuned. That will be very helpful as you go forward, not only with more modern day neuropsych assessment, but modern day teletesting. Now, this is again from the APA Testing Advisory Group, which Neil has been very active in and has been our major leader in this regard. All right, let's talk about what's coming down the pike. Lots of fascinating things, including Incident 2, which we ran away from back in the 90s when a couple of us created the new neuropsych testing codes and the technician codes. They wanted us to get away from Incident 2. Well, guess what? After a couple of decades, we're going back to it. And then a new set of codes that you may want to be aware of as we move down the path of a more expanded view of neuropsychological assessment. All right, a lot of this has to do with the so-called conversion factor, which is settled on 33.06, which means that we're going to lose about $1.55 for every unit. That this is probably going to result in a 2% reduction in Medicare, but APA and lots of other healthcare practitioners are working in unison to revert this. And I think the likelihood is that conversion factor will not change, but other things will. And when it's all said and done, we will be in a position not to lose money as we are anticipated. In part because we've been lobbying very hard for certain things. And one of the biggest things that we've lobbied, including recently when some of us met with some congressional folks, both from the Senate and the House, is to continue protecting telehealth services and maintaining the reimbursement and non-facility rates. In other words, don't change it in such a way that we're going to lose reimbursement. As you know, as economics fly, so does the service. So this has been very active, and I have to be honest, my overall feeling, having spent some time with regulatory and congressional leaders, the likelihood that most of this will be preserved. And in addition to that, we're going to add, beyond the standard things involving testing and psychotherapy, adaptive behavioral assessment, which for those of us that do intellectual disability assessments, this will be very useful. Individual psychophysiological therapy, a therapeutic intervention for cognitive function as well. So I think there's some options coming forward that not only support what we currently have in telehealth, but expand telehealth in areas that we have not even considered previously. The big one I suspect is the incident 2, and that is that you can theoretically employ other individuals, for example, technicians. And if you do so, you're going to have to provide some type of supervision. And I mentioned this before, so I want to bring it up again for you to consider at a later time. Probably all supervision moving forward will have to be general, which is something that we have encouraged right from the beginning in the 1990s. And now we are codifying it and establishing it as we move forward as the law of the land. Now, the Cognitive Assessment and Care Code, again, another potential telehealth code. This is something that we're recommending, but we don't know if will come to fruition. And you see the word APA services, that's the C6 that we created in 2017 and 18 that totally advocates for the practice of psychology. All right, now this is me, way me, only me. So I think we're working super hard, and I think likely to continue to preserve the gains that we've had in policy in terms of making sure that what we're doing remains, number one, and the reimbursement also continues. I think the likely outcome is, I think that the new codes are going to be priced and reimbursed in ways that are difficult to determine. We'll probably not have success at the very beginning, say at the beginning of the calendar year, but I suspect as things settle down, maybe within a year, those new codes will be useful and reimbursable. However, the big question remains for those of us that do this for a living, what about reimbursement for tele-testing? My personal opinion is that we have plenty of support and research for being able to get reimbursed for testing, for neurobehavioral status exam and for feedback. I would not be surprised if category 3 is sent upon us for what we have as testing, simply because we don't have the research to support that it's the same as face-to-face. There's some good research that's coming out, but we've got a long ways to go. All right, so what's on the horizon? What should we expect next? Well, we had a big campaign recently, and it was so good to see how many of us actually submitted comments to CMS. CMS does listen. So when we ask you to please submit something, realize that that is important. I believe that 50% of all the messages sent to CMS and the last go around in terms of proposed physician fee schedule, we're having to do with psychology and by psychologists. That's a lot. Well done. Let's keep it up. That's how we make things happen. All right. So what's going behind the scenes? Some of us decided that we're not really comfortable with what's going on. And as you see, there's a small group of us that are working on one particular issue together with the APA advocacy staff and Alex Ginsberg at APA, as well as Stephen Gillespie. And that is to set up a system that there's reimbursement on Medicare and Medicaid and Medicare for trainees. We are really getting close. We're still working on it as we speak, even in the appropriations that are occurring right now in Congress. What's the possibility? I don't know. But if we don't get it by January 4th, I think the likelihood is very good that we'll open up the calendar year with a very strong message. And the likelihood is that we might be in a position to have trainees get reimbursed for Medicare and subsequently Medicaid. That would be a paradigm shift of major proportions. Now, this is about teletesting and more. What are we going to do? We're going to shift to population versus incident 2. We're going to get more integrated. So as time goes on, whether you do tele or not, it's going to be integrated and probably bundled. We're going to have 2 models. You work at a large institution, you're going to generate a lot of patients. If you work in a small private practice, you might have a boutique and more personalized. We're going to add qualitative data to quantitative data And how we get that reimbursed is going to be a challenge, especially that when you're doing some tele-testing or tele-interviewing, you may want to write more than average in terms of what you're seeing, because that will add some, not only to the reimbursable opportunity, but more importantly, to the potential challenges that one has with the limitations, perceived or otherwise, of this kind of evaluation. We worked on, several of us, Teresa, Roebuck, Spencer, among others, and we have all set up for the new neurocognitive disorders category to come out, which it did in January 1 of this year. It has not been applied yet, but that will happen probably in the next year to 3 years. And when that happens, there'll be a new system, ICD-11. It's a variation of 10, but it's a much nicer one. When that happens, we'll share with you what we've done. Until then, realize that upon us is the wonderful work that folks like, Anthony Stringer, among others, did in Minnesota, Catherine Fuchs, to make the future of neuropsychology very viable. Of all the things that we captured, for me, the most important one appeared to be extremely deep, organic belief and focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. Advocacy as well came up firing. Competencies, obviously the bottom line in what we do, but surprisingly, and for me, disappointingly, we just didn't get enough digital and telehealth in the system. Maybe that's something that we need to do. So what is going to be the future as we move forward, and especially in telehealth? Well, first of all, I think telehealth is here to stay. There's no question. I don't care if you don't like it, it's here. The science, we need a long ways to go, especially involving the testing and making sure that teletesting is as equitable, as equal as face-to-face testing, and that social justice issues don't play a role in allowing telehealth to be only for the privileged rather than for all of us. And interjurisdictional. I know that National Register and PsyPAC have jumped into it, but we've got a long ways to go to get that all cleared up. So is there a future? Damn yes. What it's going to be? It depends up to us. So how about if I just encourage you, if you're really into this, to apply to the professional practice guideline to telepsychology work group that's being formed. You have the opportunity to apply by January 20th of this coming year. And that group will be useful in helping us define more clearly where we're headed. So if you want more information, I have all kinds of good data here for you to share, including what the heck, I did this at APA, I thought I got it wrong, and that's Neil Pliskin's cell number. Write me and I'll give it to you. In the meantime, thank you for sharing this hour with me and with the SIG group. Thanks for Monica, Jaquil, and others to make this happen. And stay tuned. We have a bright future for tele-neuropsychology. Monica, back to you.
Tony, thank you so much for such important information. It is amazing how things have changed so much. Years ago, I remember attending so many presentations, and every now and then we would talk about tele-neuropsychology, and it was like something that maybe you saw in cartoons or movies about the future, but all of a sudden a pandemic happens, and here we're building the plane as we fly it, right? It is amazing. But good news about the future. I think we have a lot of hope, and I'm glad that with this interest group, we can bring together experts and individuals like you who are advocating for this type of service, because we know that it makes our services accessible to those who may otherwise not have availability or access. But because we know that there is lack of technology, we have to also, as you mentioned, advocate for these services to become available for all and not just those who are privileged. and have access to this technology. So your message is very clear, and I am so glad that you were able to convey that. We have a few comments regarding and going back to Zoom. One user said that they use Zoom, but it's secure video Zoom. So not just like regular Zoom, but Zoom does have a secure platform. So hopefully everybody is using the secure version of Zoom and not just open because, of course, of our requirements. Someone said, no question, but they are a Spanish-speaking neuropsychologist in Greenville, South Carolina. So just they wanted you to know that.
That's good. Nice to meet you.
Yes, I don't have the name, but yes. And then someone said that jurisdictional boundaries are also an issue in Canada, since so we have people from Canada. So thank you for being here. Since many psychologists are only licensed in one province, so it does present an issue with that. So.
And before you go to the next question, and what about interjurisdictional across national boundaries? You know, what about, for example, you or I or Yakil doing a neuropsych eval on someone from Mexico? You know, what does that apply? So you know, what COVID did is force us to address telehealth, teletesting, but also ask questions that we never imagined. You know, should I be able to work in South Carolina? Well, the answer is yes. The big question is, how do I do that?
Yes. And that's an important issue because it's not just the technology or the fact that you're not licensed, but when we are working with other countries and we're inserting issues of culture and language, and then issues of norms and tests available and so forth, which you mentioned that, you know, it's an issue for testing in itself. So it does present an issue, and many of us are contacted periodically from other countries to do this work, and it really does present a situation, and ethical is definitely beyond practice. So
I saw one in the chat box regarding what about reimbursement? Well, this is an interesting one this morning. Actually, despite the fact I wasn't feeling very good, I said, I need to go dig through my emails because, and the answer really is available through the APA practice and Stephen Gillespie's office. Here's the big question. Are we going to be able to keep what we have? And I think the answer is probably likely without any clear question or demanding question for 1 year after the pandemic ends. So here's a question. When does or will the pandemic end? Are we going to just flow into an endemic and then it never ends? Or are we now, it's over because Dr. Fauci actually retired? So in other words, we have to have the government tell us when it's over. But APA is working very hard to make sure it doesn't matter when it's over, that basically when it's over, it's not. Because we have discovered that despite with the scientific and technical limitations, it is an unbelievably useful add-on to our armamentarium of basically what we currently have. So there is a future. The question is, how do we make it happen? But I think for the foreseeable future, reimbursement is going to continue, especially for, in my personal viewpoint, this is Tony speaking, for interviewing and for feedback. The testing one is going to be a bigger challenge. Not only is it there scientific and practically, but maybe there also for reimbursement.
Yes. Someone asked a question, and I know you touched upon it a little bit, but maybe you can clarify. The future, will we be able to do teleassessment in all states, no matter in what state we're licensed? So can you clarify that? I know it's confusing in many ways. So.
Well, I don't have my crystal ball here. It's actually downstairs, but let me tell you what I think. I'm banking on it. Okay, let me tell you how I'm banking on it personally. I actually registered for PsyPack, and for that matter, I actually registered for the National Register. They have two systems that allow, you know, credentials to go across state lines. And I know we're tight on time, but I'll share a funny story. I needed to get my transcripts from the University of Florida, And they said they did not have transcripts available that were electronic, and they had to go to the storage area to find it. And they hadn't had anybody request their transcripts from my era in a long time. But if you're young, please imagine that there is a future across state lines. And the way you get yourself prepared is PsycPack and the National Register. Those are the two avenues that I personally believe will help achieve that. Keep in mind that you have to be really careful about all the issues involving legal and regulatory affairs.
And one issue too, also, Tony, is that each state has their own laws. So the fact that, we may advocate through PsycPack and whatnot, it doesn't mean that the state is going to allow that adoption. So I know in Florida, we're working through it and so forth, but each state is independent. So hopefully a future that every state talks to each other and they're okay, but
I think that's where we're headed. Every state will talk to each other, but until then, how are we going to do this through the process that I shared with you? The other question is, what's really important, where the patient is or where you're at? So it might vary, but in most cases is where you're at, not so much where the patient is. Now, Akil asked me to talk a little bit about the work group. The work group is being assembled in January, and basically they're going to address not only neuropsychology, obviously, but psychology testing also. And it's going to address some of the issues and many more, I hope, along the lines of what we've been talking about. So you can self-nominate, and in the slides, you have the individual there that can send you more information, and you can in turn formally apply or have one of us submit your name in support of that activity. I hope that neuropsychology is well represented, and that folks that are in this conversation today will be participating in that.
You are part of the work group, Tony, right? You're working with them as well.
No, I'm not part of it. I have not applied. I think that we need brighter minds in mind, number one. And number two, I think it might be better that I stay put at a sort of a different level to make sure that recommendations are carried out in Congress. So I definitely support the work group. And if they request my involvement, yes. But sadly enough, Monica, I'm working too hard.
Yeah, and no, I have to say you're very bright, Tony. So I disagree with that. Your statement, but also to thank you for all the advocacy that you've done in Congress. Definitely at the federal level and whatnot. It benefits so many of us. You have a comment if you want to see it under Q&A. I can read it to you.
Okay, good. Let's see. Oh boy. Yeah. This Tim, you're asking a tough question. And yeah, and since this is really a tough question, and Monica only promised me a rum and coke at the next conference, I'm gonna just simply ignore this question. No, but when we were doing the standards for educational psychological testing at the beginning of the last decade, one of the big challenges ahead was, what happens when you do things differently? For example, what happens when you translate a test? And what happens, for that matter, in the issue of teletesting? Really, the crux is this. What we want to do is we want to accommodate the circumstance, whether it's an electronic or geographic or linguistic or cultural. We want to accommodate. We don't want to modify. Okay. So for example, as soon as we take a word and translate it, from one language to the other, like the first time I did this back in the 80s, I translated, "You look like a pig," or something like that. I translated, "You look like, an animal pig," rather than dirty. Well, when you change the construct, you're modifying, you had something completely different. But we have to be thoughtful. Now, if you are into this, there's something called interactive complexity in psychotherapy, which allows you to build a little bit more in that context for the extra work that you're doing to make sure that you don't change or modify the concept or construct. That is the challenge, not only for people that are doing cultural neuropsychology, but as we move forward, for those of us who are doing teleneuropsychology, we don't want to modify the construct. We want to accommodate so more people can get more access to the work that we do.
Thank you for that answer. And certainly in our world that we do bilingual work, work is very, very relevant. One question, what happens with supervision when, say, the supervisor has two offices in two cities, maybe in the same state, but then you have supervision, you have to supervise, and I know you talked about the proximity and location and whatnot, but then you have an expert, and you mentioned, like in your case, you may be the only one, otherwise you go to Orlando, but you happen to have two offices. So what would happen in that case?
Well, that's a challenging question. And again, Monica, now you have to buy me 2 drinks. Okay, because that's in some ways harder. Just because there's only one person in North Carolina, one person in South Carolina, doesn't mean that I can have an office in the western part and supervise from here. Look carefully at that slide that talks about what direct supervision is, and I'll put it on you to define what is best. For example, at the University of Florida, the hospital is, like a mile long, literally. Does that mean that I could be in one end of the building and good to go? Or what about if my office is in here and the technician is at the hospital a mile away? Is that different? Tough. The question of direct supervision is a challenge, but it gives us more opportunity than direct, which means that you have to be right there. We are not doing direct supervision.
So not even with telehealth. So because of telehealth, because you're actually seeing the patients through telehealth, it doesn't change the fact that you are physically present. You technically are not even with the patient in the same state.
That's an interesting question. The original work that Monroe Collum and others did with Tele-Testing is that the technician is somewhere else. It's, do I provide general supervision if I'm in Dallas and the tester is in Fort Worth? To be determined.
Okay, very good. So any parting words, Tony? We only have a minute to go. So if you want to share anything else, please do so.
Well, again, thank you for everyone that made all this happen. Thank you for all the people that have been working in the trenches with the research, with the practicality, the IOPC folks, for that matter, the individuals at APA. Without them, this couldn't be there. Don't hesitate to join your state association, the INS, NAN, APA. These people, they work for you, but they can't work if you don't support them. So again, stay tuned. We're moving into a world that we don't know. We're still building that airplane, Monica, but I think when it's all said and done, it's going to be a rocket.
Yes. Thank you so much, Tony, for being here with us, for your brilliant contributions, for everything you do for our field. You're a friend personally and to all of us, so thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We had a lot of people attending, and we're very grateful to you. And just keep coming. We're going to keep offering some of these sessions regarding telehealth and digital technologies for the International Neuropsychological Society. We're grateful to you, and have a great rest of your week, and happy holidays. We will see you next year.